Kjetil Tronvoll, a peace and conflict studies researcher specializing in Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Zanzibar. In 2001, he is professor of peace and conflict studies at Bjørknes University College and heads a consultancy firm, Oslo Analytica. He's a foremost expert on all things Ethiopia, what's been happening there with the war on Tigray, and the political economy of the Horn of Africa. Today we speak in part 2 of our series on the war in Tigray, about what's happening on the ground there, the war that's being waged not only in northern Ethiopia, but also online, and what's to come for Ethiopia in general. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much. Professor Tronvoll, thank you so much for joining the podcast today. A lot has been going on in your area of expertise. I wanted to have you on because I specifically wanted to talk about the ongoings with Ethiopia and the war in Tigray. I know you've been giving a lot of media interviews. So I guess let's start off, if you'd like, give us a little bit of your background, what you've been doing lately, and we can lead that into a discussion about what's happening in Ethiopia, what's happening with Tigray and everything else.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to join you.
Sure.
I have been working, studying, researching the Horn of Africa, or Eritrea and Ethiopia political developments in particular, for over 30 years now. I'm a social anthropologist by training, and I did my first dissertation fieldwork in Eritrea just at the tail end of the Liberation War, and stayed in the country until after its sovereignty was achieved in 1993. From 1991 to 1993, I lived in a small village in highland of Eritrea. But I also traveled extensively in Ethiopia, northern Ethiopia, to assess the changes occurring at the same time there. Since then, early 1990s, I have been in the region several times a year and living extensive periods of times in Ethiopia, doing a new fieldwork in 1998-2000 during the Eritrean Ethiopian War. This time in Tigray, on the Ethiopian side of the war front, so to say, to understand how that war impacted both local identities, ethnicity and nationalism in the region. Later, my main focus has been on both the democratization process in Ethiopia. I've been following more or less all Ethiopian elections since 1992, but also on human rights concern, political institution building, and the development visions of both Eritrea and Ethiopia. And of course, being a political anthropologist, it is the local political discourse which attracts me. How does ordinary people in the village, in a city, how do they understand elite-driven politics? How do they reflect upon the changes and the developments? How do they comprehend the relapse to war every decade in their neighborhoods, so to say, in their surroundings? How do they orient themselves in order to make sense out of this political turmoil, at least as we see it from Europe?
Right. No, those are super tough questions, fascinating work that you've done. So let's set up the stage. Ethiopia is just coming out, well, that country is just coming off of a years-long war with the northern region of Tigray. The armed political wing of Tigray has taken back the capital, Mekelle. And there seems to be a sort of ceasefire, or there's at least peace, sort of, as much as you can say that right now, within the country. But I guess this sets up the stage for what could be talked about as an Ethiopian reconfiguration. I've seen that kind of that phrase been thrown around. Tell me about Ethiopia in the post-Tigray War. What is it looking like? What can we expect? Anything you have there?
Yeah, well, I think it is way too early to say it is a post-Tigray war. The war is actually intensifying as we speak.
Okay.
I spoke to the Tigrayan leadership this morning to that effect. the unilateral ceasefire declaration, as you referred to, by the federal authorities, which were issued some weeks back, was basically declaration of military defeat. They issued that statement after they were beaten militarily in central Tigray and they evacuated Mekelle. So that ceasefire declaration, immediately after they issued it, they also cordoned off and blocked all access to Tigray and continued the war through other means, and continued to arrest and ethnic profiling of Tigaris all over Ethiopia, for that matter. So I think all international analysts agree upon that this was not a sincere and genuine ceasefire declaration. It was probably issued, well, both as a face-saving mechanism, because they actually lost the military battle at cost of thousands of killed federal troops and prisoners of wars. They issued the statement in order to buy time to recruit new troops, to train, and so on. And they issued that statement to have a spin on the international discourse, saying that, oh, we now suddenly, after having committed what increasingly is known as a genocidal warfare in Tigray for 8 months, they suddenly come forward as kind of peace loving and pursuing government, and saying they had to consider the famine-struck population of Tigray and so forth. So, and that actually, the third element of putting a new spin on the international discourse was rather successful. That people, journalists, diplomats, UN, and so on, actually believed it was a ceasefire agreement, which obviously it wasn't. So the war is continuing, and over the last few days, over the last week, it has been new offensives pursued by the Tigray Defense Forces, the People's Military Force of Tigray, so to say, and they have managed to reclaim or liberate all the territories in southern Tigray and southwestern Tigray. Still, western part of Tigray are occupied by Amhara and federal forces, or are claimed by them. But the Tigray forces over the last few days have actually also pushed into Afar region and Amhara region in pursuit of the federal forces and the enmassment of new mobilized regional militia forces from the federal government. So it is a very active warfare as we speak. And hence, we don't know how this will evolve in the near future, and who is winning the final battle, so to say, is still not clear.
Right. Yeah. I spoke with someone from Crisis Group just to kind of give us a general setup of what led up to this conflict, what led up to the war. So that's really too bad to hear. It's been very difficult to get information on what's happening on the ground there today. They've kicked out New York Times journalists. They've kicked out Crisis Group analysts and a variety of others. Tell me about the actual conflict that's happening right now, or what you can. I'm very curious how, if you're able to, maybe describe how the Tigray Defense Forces, how are they able to sustain themselves through this? Because they're essentially being attacked on all fronts. They're being attacked by the Ethiopian federal troops. They're being attacked by Eritrean troops who crossed into the border. There was a report that the United Arab Emirates were assisting the government with drones and other reconnaissance resources. Who knows who else is involved covertly? How is this such a small force in Tigray, a very small region in the north, able to confront those battles on all fronts?
That's a superb question. I think actually what we have seen over the last couple of months, 3 months, 4 months, will go into the curriculum of all military schools around the world. On how to wage a guerrilla struggle and convert that into a conventional warfare, as it is again now. It is a remarkable achievement, I have to say, by, as you say, a rather small group of people who have hastily mobilized an army and trained recruits and restructured their forces and confronted them through strategic offensives two of Africa's biggest armies,
yes.
Ethiopian Federal Army and the Eritrean Army, and in a matter of 2-3 months actually managing to win the battles and to push back these two armies out of their territory, so to say, and to huge costs. They have decimated the capacity of the Ethiopian Federal Forces. And that is, you know, on paper, that shouldn't be possible to do,
right.
to be frank. It shouldn't be possible to do that. But they obviously, these guys heading the TDF forces, they are the best skilled military strategists and generals, tactical officers Africa have, probably, in terms of experience and leadership training, because they are basically the officers which were kicked out by the Ethiopian Federal Forces by Abiy Ahmed when he took power.
Right.
They have a long-term experience in warfare. They know their own region intimately. It is a very mountainous, rugged region, perfect for guerrilla warfare. And they were very pressured in the early phase of the war, from November to January, exactly as you also mentioned, the use of drone capacity, probably emanating from the Emirates military base in Assab in Eritrea, really made an imprint on TDF forces. It took out the mechanized brigade they did have, the artillery. They took out some communication centrals and so on, which pushed them back literally on their feet up to the mountains, where they regrouped. But also as a windfall of the change of government in DC, when the Biden administration took over, they put pressure on the Emirates to close the military base in Assab, primarily in order to stop the war in Yemen. But a windfall, right. It was also stopped then the drone warfare against Tigray. That also changed the dynamics on the ground, and gradually from end of January, February, TDF forces have taken back more and more terrain, but they have sustained themselves primarily by capturing military hardware and resources from their enemies. As they did in the 1970s and 80s, when they fought the 17 years of guerrilla struggle against the Derg military junta at that time. The primary source of military hardware comes from the enemy, from captured material. And they have managed then, particularly since the Operation Alula, as it was called, which started last month when they liberated Mekele, the federal forces just collapsed and they pulled out in disarray, leaving huge supplies of both vehicles, heavy artillery, and military depots, which were then taken by TDF. So the TDF and the TDF army, they have all now mechanized brigades, for instance. So today, the last month or so, they have waged a conventional warfare against the Ethiopian Federal Forces and the regional forces and the Eritrean forces. But as we speak, the Tigray region is 100% cut off from its neighbors, so to say. Eritrea in the north, Ethiopia in the south. They cut the last supply line, or the last, road of humanitarian assistance through Afar region was cut yesterday. And they also, the Amhara Federal Forces control West Tigray, so they don't have access to the Sudanese border. So it is then a question of time, obviously. How long can they sustain a conventional warfare when they don't get in supplies? Both fuel and munition and food and whatever a huge army needs to operate.
Is there any way they can get those resources through Sudan, through the West, or is that a peculiar? I'm not totally. Sorry.
No, not as of today, but because the western part of Tigray, which borders Sudan, are now controlled by the federal and Amhara forces.
I see.
But everything points towards that the next offensive waged by the TDF will be westward in order to create a corridor to Sudan, primarily to get in humanitarian supplies to the famine-struck population. There are hundreds of thousands of people starving in Tigray as we speak, and the regional government needs to ensure a steady flow of humanitarian aid, so to say, to the famine-struck population, which the Ethiopian government prevents, humanitarian aid to come to Tigray.
Yeah. How are conflict journalists like yourself getting information about what's happening on the ground today? Because the last footage I saw, there were humanitarian vehicles going into Tigray finally after the Tigray Defense Forces had liberated Mekelle. There was a World Food Program trucks getting in there. Are they gone now? Have they been forced to evacuate? Now the supply lines are cut off. How are we getting it? Or what's the best way to get information up to date on what's happening? I mean, is it Twitter?
First of all,
it's kind of a joke. It's kind of a joke, but it's kind of not also.
Yeah.
What's the best open source intelligence situation we have? Yeah.
Just let me say, I'm not a journalist. I'm a professor, so I don't.
I understand.
I don't want to insult the journalist of claiming to be one. So,
but I mean for everybody. So I mean, journalists should be relying on that information. Conflict analysts, professors. I mean, we all need this information, right? So, what's the best way to get this to understand what's happening in real time?
Well, it is a challenge, obviously, also because the Ethiopian government has cut telecommunication lines into the northern Ethiopia. So we don't have open lines, so to say, either internet or mobile phones or landlines are currently operating. So you need an extensive network of local people, both in Tigray and in Ethiopia, in Eritrea, in Sudan, who managed to get through on the local, mobile network or some other means. People are still traveling in and out of the region. There are still international diplomats and humanitarian workers going in and out of Tigray, which brings back, of course, the formal, very much needed information for the humanitarian work, which are organized. You do have political contacts in Ethiopia, academics, other engaged citizens who you communicate with directly or through social media platforms. And the leadership in Tigray, the TDF and the military leadership, they all have satellite phones, satellite links. So I speak regularly with them to get their side of the story. Obviously, you need to triangulate all the information you do get in order to kind of piece together the best understanding you have. But it is a challenge as access to the conflict zones are so restricted, very much restricted. There are some journalists who are allowed in and out, but very, very few, and increasingly fewer, so to say, as the government in Ethiopia now have put new restrictions on media operating in the country.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. I'm always curious about how one can extrapolate what's happening. Triangulate that information as it comes through from a variety of sources. You're always trying to decipher what all of this means. Can we talk for a moment about Eritrea? Last I've read, the Eritrean troops have largely moved out of the Tigray region, possibly due to their success against the Ethiopian federal military. I have not seen a lot of analysis on why Eritrea was there to begin with, what Eritrea did. Eritrea has been described as the North Korea of Africa. I mean, it's kind of it is a totalitarian, very closed state, right? What were its troops doing there? Where are they now? How do we understand how Eritrea fits into all of this?
Well, it is a complicated history between Eritrea and Tigray, going back centuries, but it is also a complicating history between EPLF, the Eritrean Liberation Front, which assumed power in Eritrea in 1991, and TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which at the same time assumed power in Ethiopia after the fall of the military junta. Then you had the fallback in 1998-2000 with a new war, basically between Eritrea and Tigray over some disputed territories, but it was more about power. Who should be the dominating force in the Horn of Africa? Should it be President Isaias Afwerki of Eritrea, or should it be Meles Zenawi, the leader of TPLF and the leader of EPRDF, the Ethiopian government at that time. And some old grudges needed to be settled, at least from the Eritrean or President Isaias's viewpoint. Why is Eritrea engaged in the current war, which is still considered to be a domestic affairs, so to say, in Ethiopia? Basically, the so-called peace process, which started after Abiy Ahmed became prime minister in April 2018, that was the objective from Isaias Afwerki, the president of Eritrea, to enter into that peace agreement was not peace. It was his way of continuing and enhancing a war against TPLF and Tigray, because suddenly he had an ally in Addis Ababa who also wanted to marginalize TPLF because of the threat TPLF posed to Abiy Ahmed's new visions of Ethiopia. So it's quite clear from the very first statement President Isaias Afwerki uttered after the peace, in recognizing the peace process, he said, "Game over, TPLF. This is it. Now I came to take you." And ever since, that has kind of been the position from Isaias. And when the war broke out the 4th of November last year, Eritrean forces were ready. They were coordinated. It was an aligned, coordinated attack from the south, the Ethiopian forces, and the north, Eritrean forces on Tigray. Tigrayan forces were actually the backbone of the fighting force early this year in Tigray, committing vast atrocities, killings of civilians, rape of Tigrayan girls and women, destructions of cultural heritage sites, destructions of infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, hospitals, water supplies, schools, universities, you name it. Everything was looted and robbed. Even individual peasant farm household were looted with agricultural equipment, oxen, and so on, in order to starve out the population. Hence some of the preconditions for the famine we do have today in Tigray is because of that destructive warfare Eritrean troops committed in Tigray. So I think the purpose, again, this is not a war between Eritrean people and Tigrayan people. Sure. It is a war very much engineered by the leadership. And they are kind of fighting on behalf personally of Isaias Afwerki, so to say. His need for revenge, his need to settle all scores, his need to show that he is the primary mover in the horde, and he need to destroy and destruct TPLF in that regard. As part of the offensive we saw last month, when the Tigray forces pushed back the Ethiopian forces very quickly, Eritrean forces did not come to Ethiopia's rescue, even though they were allies in this war. Isaias and the Eritrean military leadership understood that, well, here we need to be safeguarding our own capacities, and we better pull back to northern Tigray to defend our border, because the war is changed. The war has shifted. And we shouldn't waste our life, we shouldn't waste our material to rescue some Ethiopian federal forces, leave them to their own destiny. We pull back and fortify and make defensive positions in northern Tigray and along our own border. And that's where the Eritreans are standing now. They are still on Tigrayan soil in certain areas, but they have pulled back and regrouped and reorganized, probably restaffed also, awaiting a TDF offensive to come.
Interesting. A side question, I guess, in terms of Eritrean political economy, it's a totalitarian state. They're having to pay for this military on the border. How does that country sustain itself? What are the main?
The macroeconomics, they don't understand how Eritrea can exist, because right. Basically the economy is, it doesn't fit any of our macroeconomic modeling. Right. As has been documented over the last 20 years, Eritrea is the only, with the exception to North Korea, where the state employs mass slavery to sustain its economy. Right. The national service campaign, where all men and women above 18 need to serve, or has over the last 2 decades been indefinite service, where they use the military conscripts to civilian work, to reconstruction work, to office work, as medics, as teachers, whatever, without payment. And the elite takes a lot in its own pocket, so to say, through both an organized people trafficking by the military leadership of Eritrea. Eritrea is one of the main producers of refugees, as you know, and a lot of them are trafficked out, have to pay the military leadership to get across, you know. It is a corrupted, criminalized state, basically, and who are preying on their own people. At the same time as they have received certain support by other Middle Eastern actors, both financial and military. But you don't need, it is a country which have been on the standstill for 20 years. They haven't put in motion big development project, infrastructure project, and so on. So they don't, they can survive on a rather meager inflow of money. Basically, the main foreign currency earner for Ethiopia are remittances from the Eritrean diaspora overseas, voluntarily remittances, or enforced, coerced, that so-called 2% taxation system. They tax all their diaspora Eritrean descendants, 2% income tax, if they want to have some kind of relationship back home. The second source has been gold mining and mineral production. Yeah.
What would you say last? Gold mining and mineral production as well?
Mineral production, yeah. There are some international companies, Canadian companies and so on, doing rather productive and revenue producing gold mines and mineral mines in Eritrea, which is the second main foreign currency earner for the regime.
Right. Yeah, I was going to ask how this would be sustainable and if there was a possibility to see a future where Ethiopia actually pushed to the Red Sea, but that might be a little bit of a fantasy.
No, that was part of Abiy Ahmed's plan with the peace agreement, that Ethiopia should get a free access to the sea, so to say, that you would have a integration process between Eritrea and Ethiopia, where Ethiopia will get full access to the ports of Massawa and Assab. Ethiopia decided last year, you know, to rebuild the Ethiopian Navy, for instance, indicating their interest to use the coastline on the Red Sea in that regard. So that was part, but that, you know, is can very well be interpreted as a positive economic integration policy for the whole Horn of Africa, that these two countries come together. I strongly support that. Obviously, today there are different kind of open or hidden motives among certain Ethiopian political elites who wants to reclaim also part of Eritrea, or bring all of Eritrea back to the motherland, as some argue. So Eritrean nationalists are increasingly nervous that Isaias Afwerki actually is spoiling Eritrean sovereignty as part of this war, that the outcome might be detrimental for Eritrean continued sovereign status.
Right. Yeah, interesting to see what develops there. When it comes to the Tigray War and all of these, and all of the conflicts and all of the residual human rights abuses that have happened, you have been, in my view, nuanced but highly critical of the behavior of the Ethiopian state government, the Eritreans, and as a result, that has developed into sort of online backlash. I know you've been the victim of harassment and death threats. I've seen a lot of things from the Eritrean side on Twitter. I'm kind of curious if there's a social media angle here, because I mean, this country doesn't have internet capability. So are these diaspora people talking? Are they paid agents? Who are the ones leveling the criticism? But can you talk a little bit about that? What kind of criticism have you received? What were the death threats that you received? What happened with that? And how can we also understand, as soon as you level a human rights critique against the actors in this war, you're almost immediately met with thousands of people from a variety of sides saying, "Oh, you're a shill," or you're obviously lying. I mean, it's just Yeah. Do you I'm sorry that that's not a totally clear question, but do you know what I'm getting
good.
at?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
Thank
so.
you. Okay.
I can start to say that, I've been, I'm a former professor of human rights at the University of Oslo. So human rights has been a key research concern for me for 30 years. And I have written books and dozens of articles criticizing the EPRDF regime from 91 to 98, to 2018, on their human rights performances. I've been very critical to TPLF's human rights record, just to make that straight. And that can be easily documented if you do any search on Amazon.com or on any academic search engine. You will find my articles criticizing that. I will continue to criticize Ethiopian and Eritrean governments as my duty as a researcher and a professor who do research on these issues. And it should be a duty of any engaged citizens in Ethiopia or global citizens to do so against any regime committing human rights abuses. But yes, that is true what you say, that of course this war is not only fought on the battlefields, it's certainly also fought on the social media platforms and virtually. More intensely sometimes it seems than in real life. And very early on I was attacked, and it is an intriguing way to see that, and I do gather that information from my own research, who is attacking me when and how, that the Amhara Ethiopia chauvinist diaspora in Washington, D.C., which is very powerful, coordinated by the ESAT satellite television station, quickly attacked me last fall with a coordinated campaign. That campaign linked to the Eritrean nationalist diaspora activists, which are also, some of them are officials, troll factories sponsored by the Eritrean regime. Others are kind of volunteering, also starting to attack me. So the joining of forces of Eritrean nationalists and Amhara Ethiopian nationalists, which used to be arch enemies,
right?
But now suddenly they have a common enemy, Tigray, and anyone who comment on or criticize that the warfare in Tigray becomes an enemy, becomes a target in their view. But these two environments have direct access to the palace in Addis Ababa, so to say, to the government of Ethiopia, and it's partly coordinated through Ethiopian agencies inside the Ethiopian Electronic Intelligence Agency, for instance, who also criticized me and attacked me. So it has been a common standard for all of us who try to nuance, who try to provide empirical-based information and criticism to be attacked, and slurs and threats and you name it are thrown our way. That's the new reality we all have to relate to. Hopefully it will decrease in after this conflict is over, whenever that is. But I think it is important, obviously, journalists, activists, researchers need to stand their ground if they have an empirical solid base to argue from. And I believe I have that.
Yeah, for sure. Certainly. What in your view has, and I ask this on every episode to every expert I speak with, what do you believe, if anything, has Western media completely gotten wrong, or they failed to ask, or how could they have been better in this coverage? I'm curious about the things that we may not be seeing. I'm trying to ask a question about how we can be better in the future when it comes to conflict reporting and stuff like this. I know there's a lot happening out there, and it's, as we said before, it's difficult to get information. But was there anything specific you saw in the coverage of this, and maybe not even in Tigray, even pre-Tigray war? What do you have anything to say about that?
Well, I think this, I have repeatedly stated this, that this was the best announced war to come in Africa for decades. We all, those who have an interest to do research in Ethiopia and who has the contacts, knew that this war would come at least a year before it broke out. So to get attention to that fact was impossible, more or less, from international media. But you can say international media report on war. They don't report on wars to come, so to say.
Sure.
But it was impossible to engage in preventive diplomacy, for instance, for international diplomats or UN system and so on. They just brushed me aside when I tried to warn about the war to come. When the war broke out, it took some time before the media, international media, managed to get on the ground, so to say. And that has been the main problem, to get access in Ethiopia and then to get access to Tigray. There were very few reporters stationed in Ethiopia, just a handful, who have done a remarkable job under extremely difficult circumstances. But the lack of journalistic personnel who have traveled to the region is obviously hampering a more broad, solid, empirical-based reporting. Again, the handful of people, journalists there, are doing a remarkable job, and of course their local stringers and local reporters too. Brave achievements. I think what is missing is more what is happening elsewhere in Ethiopia. Again, the focus unilateral on the Tigray War. What is happening with the Oromo insurgency? It is a low-scale warfare in Oromia, the biggest regional state in Ethiopia. What is happening? What's the sentiment in southern Ethiopia versus they're sending their young boys and daughters up to be killed in the northern front? What are the families, what are the mothers and fathers thinking of the new recruitment campaign where people are sent as Conan fodder to the north again, as they have experienced every generation? Those kind of sentiments, that kind of contextual reporting from outside the conflict zone itself, but very much relevant to understand the conflict dynamics, I think is lacking. Again, it is difficult to travel in Ethiopia now for all foreign reporters, so that it is understandable, but I think we should try to broaden out and also to listen to the voices not in the conflict zone directly, but who are also suffering from the consequences of all this happening.
Right. Yeah, one of the reasons I'm just so fascinated with Ethiopia, I had the pleasure of traveling there in September 2019, about a year before that war started. But I was there with some academics and photojournalists visiting for an extended period of time. It's kind of unusual, but visiting one of the indigenous tribes, the Mercy. And there was many reports, they've had their own struggles with the Ethiopian government, trying to assimilate them, moving them or moving them off of their ancestral land to make way for Chinese factories. In some cases, disappearing some people in those tribes. And I was curious if since the Ethiopian state government had its hands full in the Tigray War, if in a weird paradoxical turn of events, these indigenous tribes actually had a little bit more freedom suddenly because they were the Ethiopian state was off their backs. I'm not sure what the answer to that question is, but yeah. Anyway,
it might be. Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think what we see, it is an effect of that the security complex, the federal army has been pulled back from the regional states and from the local communities in order to fight the war in Tigray, and also in order to be in preparedness for a possible border war with Sudan, which is also brewing. Yeah, and that has left space for insurgencies to grow, like the OLA insurgency in Volga in Oromia and elsewhere in Oromia. But it has probably also, eased off some of those state intervention projects elsewhere, in the sense that both the security and administrative personnel to a degree have been redeployed elsewhere, but basically also because the Ethiopian state is more or less on an economic collapse because of the cost of the warfare and the decline of development budget support and the decline of foreign direct investments in Ethiopia. So that has also possibly suspended some of these big transformational state project, which you saw particularly in Omo, South Omo, affecting the Mursi and so on. But again, we need people on the ground. I don't know. I haven't been there over the last couple of years. What is happening there? How are they feeling about, what's happening in North? How are they thinking about reorganizing themselves in terms of reclaiming some of that political autonomy they are promised to have under the Ethiopian constitution, but which Abiy Ahmed had re-centralized during his tenure. These are very interesting and very pertinent issues to follow up. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Professor. I really do appreciate your time, and I'm happy to have you on again as events develop and you have time. This has been incredibly valuable and a great conversation. I really do appreciate you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me again.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.